Look at your hands. Really look at them. The same hands that built pyramids, dug canals, mined ore from the earth. According to clay tablets that have survived nearly 4,000 years. Your hands exist because gods once did the same work. They dug, they hauled, they labored until they could not labor anymore, and then they created us to take their place. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. These ancient records have waited millennia to be understood. They can wait a little longer while you drift off. Subscribe and stick around. Tonight we are going to explore something fascinating about the Anunnaki. Not the version you may have heard about online, not the alien miners from another planet. We are going to look at what the ancient Sumerian tablets actually say, and what they say might surprise you. The gods described in these texts were not primarily creators. They were workers, laborers, diggers of ditches, and this distinction changes everything about how we understand these ancient stories. The primary source for this story is called the Atrahasis epic, written on clay tablets around 1700 BCE, though the story itself is certainly older. The oldest surviving copy was made during the reign of a Babylonian king named Ammi-Saduqa, the great-grandson of the famous Hammurabi, a scribe named Ipik. Aya carefully pressed a reed stylus into wet clay, preserving a narrative that would reshape our understanding of ancient religion. The opening lines are remarkable. When the gods were like men, they begin. When the gods bore the work and suffered the toil. Think about that for a moment. These were not remote cosmic beings directing creation from above. They were working suffering, struggling with physical labor just as humans would later do. The text continues with a clear statement of hierarchy. Anu, the sky god and supreme ruler, divided the cosmos among the great gods. Heaven belonged to Anu. The earth was assigned to Enlil, the underground waters, the Abzu, went to Enki, and beneath these ruling Anunnaki was another group of divine beings called the Igigi. The text is explicit about what work the Igigi had to do. The gods had to dig out canals. It says had to clear channels, the lifelines of the land. The Igigi dug out the Tigris River and then dug out the Euphrates. This is not metaphorical language. This is not symbolic. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that divine beings literally excavated the rivers that made their civilization possible. Here is where the common understanding of these texts diverges from what they actually say. You may have heard that the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, that they needed gold for their planet's atmosphere, that humans were created as slave labor for gold mining operations. This narrative has become extremely popular over the past 50 years. But when scholars who actually read Sumerian and Akkadian examine these texts, they find something different. The word for gold in Sumerian is kug-sig. You can search the entire Atrahasis epic and you will not find this word. The work described in the creation narrative involves canal digging, irrigation maintenance, and agricultural labor, not mining. The distinction matters because it changes the meaning of the story entirely. The Mesopotamians were not describing extraction of precious metals for export to another world. They were describing the fundamental work that sustained their own civilization. Someone had to dig the canals. Someone had to maintain the irrigation systems. Someone had to keep the rivers flowing to the fields. The Atrahasis epic tells us the Igigi performed this labor, for 3,600 years. That number corresponds to 1 Sa in Sumerian mathematics, a unit in their base 60 counting system. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is clear. The divine workers labored for an impossibly long time before reaching their breaking point. The gods' load was too great. The text reads, "The work was heavy. The distress was much. They counted years of drudgery, and 40 more years was too much. They were complaining, denouncing, muttering down in the ditch." Picture divine beings grumbling about their working conditions while waist deep in mud and water. Then something remarkable happened. The Igigi organized. They gathered together and made a decision that would echo through mythology for thousands of years. They rebelled. "Let us face up to our foreman, the prefect," they declared. "He must take off our heavy burden upon us." They called for battle. They set fire to their tools. The text describes them surrounding the great house of Enlil by night. Enlil, chief god of the Anunnaki, awoke to find his estate under siege by the very workers who were supposed to serve him. This was not merely a complaint. This was a divine labor strike, a work stoppage among the gods themselves. The response of the ruling gods is fascinating. Enlil was terrified. He called an emergency assembly. When his messenger asked who was responsible for the rebellion, the Igigi refused to identify a single leader. "Every one of us gods has declared war," they said. "We have put a stop to the digging. The toil was killing us." Enki, the god of wisdom and the underground waters, proposed a solution. Rather than crush the rebellion, rather than punish the workers, he suggested creating something entirely new, beings who could take over the labor. Beings fashioned from clay and divine essence, human beings. The birth goddess Nintu, also known as Ninhursag, was summoned to perform the creation. But this was no simple shaping of mud. A god had to be sacrificed. The text names him Geshtu, which means ear or wisdom. Other versions call him Ilawela or Ila. What all versions agree on is that this god possessed intelligence, and his blood was essential to the process. They slaughtered him in their assembly. The tablets say, "Nintu mixed clay with his flesh and blood." They heard the drumbeat forever after. A ghost came into existence from the god's flesh, and she proclaimed it as his living sign. The ghost existed so as not to forget the slain god. We carry divine essence within us, but it is the essence of sacrifice. The tablets describe Nintu creating 14 humans in the first batch, 7 males and 7 females. After 10 months of gestation in divine wombs, the first humans emerged into the world. Their purpose was explicit. "You have slaughtered a god together with his intelligence." The text says, "I have relieved you of your hard work. I have imposed your load on man." This is the core revelation of the Atrahasis epic. Humans were not created for worship, not for companionship with the divine, not even for some cosmic experiment. We were created as replacement workers. The gods were tired of digging ditches. They made us to dig them instead. Now, here is where we need to address the popular interpretation that has spread so widely in recent decades. In 1976, an author named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. He claimed that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru. He said they came to Earth to mine gold. He said humans were created as slave labor for these mining operations. Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies worldwide. His ideas have been featured in television documentaries, YouTube videos, and countless websites. The image of the Anunnaki as gold, mining aliens has become deeply embedded in popular culture. Many people who have heard of the Anunnaki know only this version of the story. But here is the thing. Scholars who actually read Sumerian and Akkadian have examined Sitchin's claims extensively. They have found serious problems. The translation of Anunnaki as those who from heaven came, which Sitchin popularized, is not supported by any ancient dictionary. The actual meaning is closer to princely seed or royal offspring. The term Nibiru, which Sitchin claimed was a 12th planet, appears in Mesopotamian astronomical texts. But scholars like Michael Heiser, who has a doctorate in Hebrew and ancient Semitic languages, have analyzed every known cuneiform text mentioning Nibiru. The term refers to Jupiter, Mercury, the god Marduk, or a star, never to an undiscovered planet beyond Pluto. The Abzu, which Sitchin claimed was Africa or a mining region, actually meant the cosmic underground freshwater ocean in Mesopotamian cosmology. It was the domain of Enki associated with wisdom, magic, and the life-giving waters beneath the earth. The ancient Sumerians were not describing a continent on the other side of the world. This matters not to diminish the wonder of these ancient texts, but to deepen it. The actual story the Mesopotamians told is arguably more profound than the alien mining narrative. They believed divine beings once did the work that humans now do. They believed we carry the blood and intelligence of a sacrificed god. They believed our purpose is cosmic, even if that purpose is labor. The Anunnaki in the actual texts were the great gods, the decision makers, the ones who decreed fates in the poem. Enki and the world order. The Anunnaki do homage to Enki and decree the fates of mankind. They were not laborers themselves. That role belonged to the Igigi, the younger or lesser gods who eventually rebelled. The confusion between Anunnaki and Igigi in popular culture is significant. In the earliest texts, these were clearly distinct groups. The Anunnaki ruled, the Igigi worked. Over time, in later Babylonian usage, the terms sometimes became interchangeable, but in the Atrahasis epic, the distinction is clear. The 7 great Anunnaki made the Igigi carry the workload sevenfold. Why did the canal digging narrative become a gold mining narrative in popular culture? Part of the answer lies in translation choices and interpretive frameworks. If you approach these texts looking for evidence of extraterrestrial mining operations, you might read labor and extraction differently than a scholar approaching them as religious mythology. Another part of the answer involves the appeal of the extraterrestrial hypothesis itself. The idea that ancient humans were visited by advanced beings from another world captures the imagination in ways that stories about divine canal diggers might not. Gold mining for an alien planet sounds more scientific, more technological, more relevant to modern concerns. But there is something lost when we replace the actual ancient narrative with a modern science fiction overlay. The Mesopotamians were grappling with profound questions about existence, labor, suffering, and purpose. Why do we work so hard? Why is life difficult? Where does human consciousness come from? Their answers, encoded in these tablets, deserve to be understood on their own terms. The work described in the Atrahasis epic corresponds exactly to the fundamental infrastructure needs of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded unpredictably, without extensive canal systems, irrigation networks, and constant maintenance. Agriculture would have been impossible. Cities could not have existed. Archaeological evidence confirms the centrality of water management to Mesopotamian life. Temple records document work crews, their rations, their supervisors. The bureaucratic apparatus of the gods' temples organized human labor in ways that mirror how the mythological texts describe divine labor being organized. The myths reflected and legitimized social reality. The Atrahasis epic may have served to explain and justify the existing social order. If even gods once had to perform hard labor, then surely human workers should accept their lot. If divine beings created humans specifically to do work, then work must be our fundamental purpose. The mythology both describes and prescribes, and yet there is also something subversive in the narrative. The workers rebelled, they refused to continue. They surrounded the house of the highest authority and demanded change. The gods did not crush this rebellion. They acknowledged the workers' grievances as legitimate. The toil was killing us, the Ajiji said, and the Anunnaki accepted this assessment. The solution: creating humans can be read in multiple ways. It freed the divine workers from their burden, but it also created a new class of laborers who would inherit the same grinding work. The hierarchy was preserved by adding a new layer at the bottom. We are that layer. The story does not end with human creation. The Atrahasis epic continues with human population growth, divine annoyance at human noise, and multiple attempts at destruction, plague, drought, famine, finally the Great Flood. The gods kept trying to reduce or eliminate their replacement workers, yet humans kept surviving. Enki, the god who proposed human creation in the first place, consistently protected humanity against Enlil's destructive impulses. He warned the wise man Atrahasis to build a boat before the flood. He found ways around divine oaths to preserve human life. The tension between these two gods drives much of Mesopotamian mythology. After the flood, measures were instituted to control human population, infant mortality, infertility, religious celibacy. The text presents these as divine solutions to the problem of human abundance. We exist, but we exist within limits deliberately imposed by the gods. Our creation came with a built-in expiration date. What does it mean that humans were created as replacement workers rather than as objects of divine love? The Mesopotamians seemed comfortable with this origin story. It explained why humans had to work so hard. It explained the relationship between humans and gods. They needed us. We needed them. The cosmos functioned through this mutual dependence. The sacrifice of the wise god Geshtu, to provide divine essence for human creation, adds another layer. We are not merely animated clay. We carry intelligence that once belonged to a deity. The ghost of that god exists within us. The text says so that the slain god would not be forgotten. Our consciousness is a memorial. Modern scholars like Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard, who published groundbreaking translations of the Atrahasis epic in 1965, have spent careers studying these texts. They approach the material as historians and linguists, trying to understand what the ancient authors meant to communicate to their own audiences. Their work reveals a sophisticated religious and philosophical system. The Mesopotamians ask questions about existence, purpose, and suffering. They developed narratives to address these questions. Those narratives were not primitive or naive. They were the product of centuries of reflection on the human condition. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by Oxford University, now makes thousands of translated texts available to anyone with internet access. You can read these ancient stories yourself. You can see what the tablets actually say. The gap between specialist knowledge and public understanding is narrowing. When you read the Atrahasis epic directly, you find something more interesting than alien gold miners. You find ancient humans wrestling with the same questions we still ask. Why do we suffer? What is our purpose? Where do we come from? Why must we work? The answers they developed are not our answers, but the questions are eternal. The gods in these texts are not the omnipotent, omniscient deities of later monotheism. They quarrel, they make mistakes, they get tired, they need human service to sustain themselves. The Atrahasis epic describes gods gathering around Atrahasis's post, flood sacrifice like flies around food, desperate after days without offerings. This divine dependence on human worship created a kind of cosmic contract. We work for them. They protect us. When either side fails in their obligations, the relationship breaks down. The mythology provided a framework for understanding both cooperation and conflict between heaven and earth. The tablets that preserve these stories were not esoteric secrets. They were part of standard scribal education. Young scribes copied these epics as training exercises. The stories were meant to be known, shared, discussed. They shaped how ordinary Mesopotamians understood their world. Fragments of the Atrahasis epic have been found across the ancient Near East. From Babylonia to Assyria to the coastal city of Ugarit, the story traveled with trade routes and imperial expansion. Different versions emerged in different places, but the core narrative remained recognizable across centuries and cultures. The biblical story of the flood shows clear connections to this Mesopotamian tradition. A divine decision to destroy humanity with water. One righteous man warned to build a boat. Animals saved aboard. A sacrifice after the waters recede. The parallels are undeniable. The Mesopotamian versions are older, but the creation narrative preceding the flood is distinctly Mesopotamian. The biblical account in Genesis presents a single God creating humans from dust, with no mention of divine labor, worker rebellion, or replacement workers. The theological framework is entirely different. Comparing the texts reveals as much about their differences as their similarities. The popular ancient astronaut interpretation of these texts represents a modern mythology layered onto ancient mythology. It takes elements from the original stories and recombines them in ways the ancient authors never intended. This is not necessarily wrong. Mythologies have always evolved and been reinterpreted by later cultures, but something is lost when the reinterpretation completely replaces the original. The ancient Mesopotamians had profound things to say about work, suffering, purpose, and the relationship between humans and the divine. Those insights deserve to be heard in their own voice, not only through the filter of 20th century extraterrestrial speculation. If you are still listening, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, consider this. According to the oldest written records we have, you exist because divine workers refused to dig any more ditches. They were tired, they complained, they rebelled, and from that rebellion, from a sacrificed God mixed with clay, from the need to transfer labor to new hands, you emerged. The work they refused to do, you now do. The canals they would not dig, your ancestors dug. The infrastructure they abandoned, human hands built and maintained for the next 4,000 years. We inherited their burden, but we also inherited the intelligence of a God who died so we could exist. The Anunnaki were not miners from another world. They were the great gods of an ancient civilization, beings who decreed fates and received worship. The Igigi were the workers who rebelled, and humans were the solution to a divine labor crisis. This is what the tablets actually say. This is the story the Mesopotamians told. Whether you find this more or less interesting than alien gold miners is a matter of personal preference. But the actual ancient narrative has depth and complexity that deserves attention. It asks questions about existence that we still have not fully answered. It proposes relationships between humans and cosmos that continue to resonate. The clay tablets that preserve these stories will eventually crumble. Even in climate-controlled museum vaults, nothing lasts forever. But the stories themselves have proven remarkably durable. They survived the fall of Babylon. They survived millennia of burial. They survived translation across languages and cultures, and now they survive in digital databases accessible worldwide. Anyone can read what the Sumerians wrote about their gods, their creation, their understanding of why we exist. The mysteries are not hidden. They are waiting to be explored by anyone willing to look at the actual sources. If you have fallen asleep, these words will be here when you wake. The Anunnaki will still be decreeing fates in ancient texts. The Igigi will still be refusing to dig, and humans will still be asking where we came from, why we work, and what it all means. The questions remain even when the civilizations that asked them have turned to dust. Thank you for spending this time exploring what the ancient records actually say. Subscribe if you want to continue these journeys into humanity's oldest questions. And remember, according to the tablets themselves, the gods were laborers before they were creators. They dug canals, not mines. And we exist because they stopped. Rest well tonight. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth considering as you drift off. In South Africa, in the region where some of the world's oldest gold deposits are found, there exist thousands of stone ruins, circular structures, ancient terraces. What appear to be mining tunnels carved into the earth. These structures have been dated by some researchers to incredibly ancient periods. Mainstream archaeologists generally attribute these structures to later Iron Age cultures. The Bantu peoples who migrated into this region over the past 2,000 years. But some researchers have suggested these ruins are far older. Some have even connected them to the Sumerian accounts of the Abzu, the underground realm associated with Enki. This connection requires a significant interpretive leap. The Abzu in actual Sumerian texts refers to the cosmic underground freshwater ocean, not a geographical location in Africa, but the presence of ancient mining activity in regions rich with gold remains intriguing. Someone was extracting gold from the earth thousands of years ago. The question is, who and why? Gold mining in southern Africa does have genuine antiquity. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe, the Mapungubwe civilization, and earlier cultures all extracted gold from these lands. Some mines have been in continuous or intermittent use for many centuries. The presence of ancient mining does not require extraterrestrial explanation. But here is the thing that keeps researchers asking questions. The sophistication of some ancient mining operations seems to exceed what we would expect from the cultures traditionally credited with them. Tunnels that extend far underground, processing methods that required significant technical knowledge, organization that suggests centralized planning. The Sumerian King List, one of the oldest historical documents we possess, records kings who reigned for impossibly long periods before the flood, tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the reigns become more reasonable, centuries instead of millennia. What are we to make of this? Some scholars see the pre-flood kings as purely mythological, their long reigns symbolizing divine or semi-divine status. Others have proposed that the numbers represent something other than years as we understand them. Perhaps astronomical cycles, perhaps a different counting system entirely. The ancient astronaut theorists read these long reigns literally, suggesting that the pre-flood kings were actually long-lived extraterrestrial beings or their hybrid offspring. This interpretation requires accepting extraordinary claims, but the strangeness of the original text remains regardless of how we explain it. Gold appears throughout Sumerian texts in religious and ceremonial contexts. The gods were said to favor gold. Temples were adorned with gold. Offerings included gold. But nowhere in the creation narratives or the labor texts does the word for gold appear in connection with the work the Igigi performed. This is the central problem with the mining interpretation. The texts describe digging rivers and canals. They describe agricultural labor. They describe the maintenance of infrastructure. They do not describe mining operations. The leap from canal digging to gold mining comes from outside the texts themselves. Unless we consider an alternative reading, some have suggested that the canal narratives are euphemisms for other kinds of extraction, that the digging described was actually mining disguised as irrigation work. This interpretation requires reading against the apparent meaning of the texts. The problem with this approach is that it can make the texts say almost anything we want them to say. If we are not bound by what the words actually mean in their original language, we can find hidden messages everywhere. This is the method Sitchin employed, and it is why scholars of ancient languages reject his conclusions. And yet, questions remain. Why did the Sumerians attribute such importance to gold? Why did they believe the gods needed human labor? Why did they encode stories of divine workers refusing to work? These narratives had meaning for the people who created them. Understanding that meaning requires taking the texts seriously. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, tells a different story than the Atrahasis. In this later text, humans are created from the blood of Kingu, a rebellious god who had allied with the primordial sea goddess Tiamat against the younger gods. The purpose of human creation is still to relieve divine labor, but the specific narrative differs. In the Enuma Elish, it is specifically the god's sanctuary and shrine that humans are created to maintain. The text speaks of cult service, of offerings, of maintaining the dwelling places of the gods. This is closer to the religious reality of ancient Mesopotamia, where temple economies dominated social organization. The temples of ancient Mesopotamia were economic powerhouses. They owned land, employed workers, managed trade, and collected offerings. The priests and priestesses who served in these temples were performing divine labor in a very literal sense. They were doing the work of the gods. This economic reality shaped the mythology. When the texts describe humans being created to serve the gods, they are reflecting and justifying the actual social system. People worked on temple lands, provided offerings, and maintained cult worship. The mythology explained why this arrangement existed, but where does gold mining fit into this picture? Gold was certainly valuable in ancient Mesopotamia. It was used for divine images, temple decorations, and royal regalia. But the acquisition of gold was not the central purpose of temple economics. Agriculture was. Grain production, animal husbandry, textile manufacturing. The Sumerian word for gold, kugsig, appears in texts about trade, tribute, and temple inventories. We know they valued it. We know they acquired it through trade networks that extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Some of that gold may have come from Egypt, some from Anatolia, some from even more distant sources. By the time of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great, around 2300 BCE, Mesopotamian influence extended from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf trade routes, connected this empire to gold sources in multiple directions. The demand for gold was real. The methods of obtaining it were complex. Some of that gold may indeed have been mined by people under Mesopotamian influence or control. But the texts do not describe mining operations in the same mythological register as the creation narratives. Mining was a practical activity, not a cosmic drama involving divine rebellion and human creation. The distinction matters because it tells us what the ancient Mesopotamians considered important enough to encode in their sacred stories. The creation of humans was a theological event, explaining our purpose and our relationship to the divine. Mining was just work, important work, but not mythologically charged in the same way. If the Anunnaki were primarily miners, we would expect mining to feature prominently in the mythological texts. It does not. If gold acquisition was their central purpose, we would expect gold to appear in the creation narratives. It does not. The absence is significant. What we find instead is a sophisticated theology explaining human existence in terms of divine need. The gods needed labor. The gods needed service. The gods needed offerings. Humans were created to provide these things. This is a religious explanation for social reality, not a historical account of extraterrestrial mining operations. But the fact that we can distinguish between these interpretations does not mean the mystery is solved. We still do not know why the Sumerians told these particular stories. We still do not know what inspired their remarkably detailed accounts of divine labor, rebellion, and human creation. The Sumerian civilization emerged remarkably quickly, around 5,000 years ago. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, literature, all appeared with striking sophistication. Where did this knowledge come from? How did it develop so rapidly? These questions have puzzled researchers for generations. The traditional answer involves gradual development in the preceding Neolithic period, followed by a rapid acceleration once certain thresholds were crossed. The invention of writing allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations. Surplus agriculture freed some people from food production to specialize in other activities. This explanation is satisfying but incomplete. We still lack evidence for many of the transitional stages. The earliest Sumerian texts appear already sophisticated, not primitive. The knowledge they contain suggests long development, but the archaeological record does not clearly show that development. This gap has inspired alternative explanations. Perhaps the Sumerians inherited knowledge from an earlier, undocumented civilization. Perhaps they received teachings from beings they interpreted as gods. Perhaps the flood described in their texts destroyed evidence of earlier development. There is geological evidence for significant flooding in ancient Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are capable of massive floods. Some researchers have identified specific sediment layers that might correspond to the legendary deluge. Whether these local events inspired the universal flood narratives remains debated. If you have been drifting in and out of sleep during this exploration, that is exactly as it should be. The mysteries we have been discussing have endured for thousands of years. They will still be here tomorrow. The questions about who we are, why we work, and where we came from will persist long after you wake. The Sumerian records reveal gods who labored before humans existed. Whether we call them Anunnaki or Iji, whether we imagine them as cosmic deities, or interpret them as something else entirely, their story has echoed through millennia. It found its way into Babylonian mythology, into Assyrian libraries, into biblical narratives. The Anunnaki as miners is a modern interpretation layered onto ancient texts. The Anunnaki as divine laborers who created humans to take over their work is closer to what the texts actually say. Both interpretations grapple with the same fundamental mystery. Why did the ancient Sumerians tell these particular stories about our origins? Perhaps they were preserving memories of real events, filtered through millennia of oral tradition. Perhaps they were encoding social truths in mythological form. Perhaps they were asking the same questions we still ask today. Where do we come from? What is our purpose? Why must we work? The clay tablets that preserve these stories are remarkable achievements. Someone pressed a stylus into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago, recording words that would survive empires, invasions, and millennia of burial. Those words speak to us still, offering glimpses of how our ancestors understood their world. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by Oxford University, now makes thousands of translated texts available to anyone with internet access. You can read the Atrahasis yourself. You can see what words were actually used. You can trace the arguments between scholars about how to interpret specific passages. This accessibility is remarkable. For most of human history, these texts were known only to a handful of specialists. The clay tablets sat in museum storage. their secrets locked in a dead language that only a few dozen people in the world could read. Now that barrier has fallen. But accessibility creates its own challenges. When anyone can read translations of ancient texts, anyone can also misread them. The nuances that specialists spend years learning to recognize can be lost on casual readers. The context that changes meaning can be overlooked entirely. This is why the debate about the Anunnaki continues. Both sides can cite translated texts. Both sides can point to specific passages, but they interpret those passages through entirely different frameworks. The specialists see religious mythology. The alternative researchers see hidden history. Neither side has complete access to the truth. The specialists know the languages, but may be constrained by academic conventions. The alternative researchers bring fresh perspectives, but may lack the linguistic tools to test their theories. The conversation continues, often talking past each other. What seems clear is that the ancient Mesopotamians believed something remarkable about their gods and about human origins. They believed divine beings once performed physical labor. They believed those beings rebelled against their working conditions. They believed humans were created as replacement workers. Whether we interpret this as mythology, as distorted history, or as something else entirely depends on what framework we bring to the texts. The texts themselves do not tell us which interpretation is correct. They simply record what the ancient Mesopotamians believed, or at least what their scribes chose to write down. The scribal tradition in Mesopotamia was remarkably conservative. Texts were copied carefully from generation to generation. Changes were slow to accumulate. This means that stories composed in the 3rd millennium BCE were still being copied more or less intact in the 1st millennium BCE. The tradition was tenacious. This conservatism suggests that the stories mattered to the people who preserved them. They were not idle entertainment. They were sacred narratives explaining fundamental truths about existence. Each generation that copied these tablets was making a statement about what was worth remembering. The destruction of these libraries by conquest or disaster was catastrophic. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the great library of Ashurbanipal was buried under the ruins. It would not be excavated until the 19th century CE. For over 2,000 years, these texts waited in the earth. George Smith, the man who first translated the Flood Tablet from Gilgamesh in 1872, reportedly was so excited by his discovery that he began undressing while running around the room. The recognition that the biblical flood had an older Mesopotamian parallel was that significant. Since then, our understanding of these texts has grown immensely. We can now read Sumerian and Akkadian with reasonable confidence. We have dictionaries compiled from ancient bilingual texts. We understand the grammar and the idioms. The language barrier, while not eliminated, has been significantly reduced. Yet mysteries remain. Some texts are fragmentary. Some words appear only once, making their meaning uncertain. Some passages seem to refer to concepts we do not fully understand. The ancient Mesopotamians had their own assumptions about reality that we may not share. These gaps are where alternative interpretations flourish. Where the text is unclear, imagination fills in details. Where scholars say we do not know, others say they do. The uncertainty that characterizes honest scholarship can feel unsatisfying compared to confident claims of hidden knowledge. If you have stayed awake this long, you have accompanied me through a complex landscape of ancient texts, scholarly debates, and alternative interpretations. The Anunnaki remain enigmatic. The Iji remain mysterious. The reasons for human creation remain open to discussion. What we can say with confidence is that the ancient Mesopotamians did not describe their gods primarily as creators. They described them as workers who eventually found a way to stop working. The creation of humanity was a solution to divine labor problems, not an act of cosmic love or spiritual purpose. This is a different creation story than most of us grew up hearing. It does not flatter humanity. It does not promise special destiny. It suggests we exist because someone else did not want to dig ditches anymore. And perhaps that unflattering honesty is why these texts have maintained such enduring fascination. The questions the Sumerians asked are still our questions. Why do we labor? What is our purpose? Who made us and why? Their answers were specific to their culture and their time. Our answers may be different, but the questions themselves seem to be eternal. Thank you for spending this time with these ancient mysteries. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the questions humanity has been asking since we first learned to write. The Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, have occupied human imagination for thousands of years. They will likely continue to do so for thousands more. Rest well tonight.